Hey everyone, Mulligan here, and welcome to the Tale of Horus Traver card review. For those new, the Tale of Horus Traver is a brand new campaign released by Direwolf Digital for the Eternal card game. There are 23 new cards you can earn in this campaign. Cards that get released as part of a campaign do not show up in the draft format at this time. And because of that, I will only be talking about the cards as far as their viability for ranked play. Let's get into it. The first card on the list is Cinder Yeti, a 3-power 3/2 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. He has Overwhelm and Warp, and when he comes into play, you exhaust an enemy unit. I will go ahead and say that this is the best art in the entire set. It's just so derpy. It's just great. Anyway, this fills a spot on the power curve where fire as a single faction was somewhat lacking. You had to look at multi-faction units if you were playing fire and wanted a 3-drop. Otherwise, your options were pretty much Centauri Brigand and Assembly Line. Both cards are for super aggressive decks and don't really fit in much else. The summon effect on this is pretty aggressive as well, but the Warp in particular is what differentiates Cinder Yeti from other 3-drops. This is a welcome addition to fire. The next card is Kindle. This is a 3-power spell requiring 2 fire influence to play. You gain +4 power this turn, and if Spark is activated, you gain +5 power this turn instead. I will admit, I completely misread this card as maximum power, and immediately tossed it aside. Then I read it correctly, and realized this is a potentially dangerous card that could enable degenerate strategies. I think Direwolf knows what they're doing with this though, so that probably won't happen. I am interested in seeing what combo strategies pop up using this ramp card for fire decks, particularly with Trail Stories. With this having Spark, that signals that this could be meant for those spell-heavy Skycrag decks that I kept talking about when Omens cards were getting spoiled, since Spark is Skycrag's mechanic. We'll have to see what people come up with though. The next card is Crimson Firemaw, a 4-power 5/4 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has flying, and when Crimson Firemaw hits the enemy player, reduce the cost of the top card of your deck by 4. There was a lot of hype surrounding this card when Brian Kibler spoiled it. This has found its way into not just aggressive fire decks like Stone Scar, but even Praxis midrange, which I found surprising at first, but it makes sense if you think about it. Praxis midrange runs a ton of 6-drops, and if you can get them down to 2 cost, that is huge. Especially given that their marquee card, Heart of the Vault, can be seen off the top of your deck thanks to Warp, which gives you the option to reduce its cost if you can get an attack in with Firemaw and then Warp it in. So you get a lot of cost reduction going on. This is a solid 4-drop that will definitely fit into more fire decks, unlike another overhyped card from Omens. Stone Scar and Praxis decks are the more obvious choices, but I'm really hoping this enables a Skycrag midrange archetype as well. The next card is Power Stone, a 2-power relic requiring 1 time influence to play, and while it's in play you have +1 maximum power. I think I've seen every time-based midrange deck except for Elysian run this card so far. I've even ran into Dark Combre variants with Tavrod running this. It's a solid card. There are some mid-range decks, however, that will prefer to run Initiate of the Sands instead, due to what points in their power curve they want to ramp into. Elysian is one of those decks because turn 3 is pretty important for them. That said, Power Stone costs a bit more, but is also much harder to remove, so the ramp effect is more likely to stick around. It hasn't made a big splash in the metagame yet, but I expect this to see more play in the coming weeks. The next card is Dilfex Stalker, a 3-power 2/2 unit requiring 1 time influence to play. It has Killer, and when it comes into play, you look at the top card of your deck, and you may put it on the bottom. The Dinosaur Tribe got a little bit of love from this campaign. This is an interesting card. The stat line, it seems underwhelming, especially for something that has Killer, but this is meant to be played in Dinosaur Tribal decks, which are typically Elysian, and typically have access to multiple ways to buff their units like Evelina Valley Searcher, Xenon Obelisk, and even Avisaur Patriarch. Combined with those, you can get a pretty decent killer off to deal with a problematic unit. The biggest reason I like this card though is at its worst, it helps you filter through your draws with the summon effect. So it doesn't have the problem of being a dead draw late game like a lot of the other early game units do. The next card is Devoted Theurge, a 4-power 4/4 unit requiring 2 time influence to play. When he comes into play, you gain 4 health, and during your turn you can pay 6 to give Devoted Theurge +1/+1, and you gain 1 health. A lot of people immediately dismissed this card when it was initially spoiled because it's not Sandstorm Titan. And it's understandable because when you're evaluating cards to put in your deck, you will always compare it to the strongest card in the faction you're playing with the same cost, at least when it comes to units. And this card lacks the stat line that Titan has. But this should be looked at as either a card to run alongside Sandstorm Titan, or a card that specifically should be used in Life Force decks, which tend not to run Sandstorm Titan. Whether that's wrong or not, we'll see, but Devoted Theurge is a good card in its own right, mainly due to its late game ability, which mitigates flooding and provides a way of constantly activating Life Force, which you generally want if you're going to play that style of deck. The next card is Copperhall Paladin, a 4-power 3/4 unit requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. He has Lifesteal, and when you play a weapon on Copperhall Paladin, play a Justice Sigil from your deck depleted. I feel like this guy hasn't gotten enough love. No one really says this is a bad card, but it's not particularly amazing either. Clearly, you have to put him in a deck that has some focus around weapons. Putting weapons together with Power Search is interesting though. Maybe this is supposed to be paired with cards that require triple Justice Influence to play, since you need 2 Justice Influence just to put this down in the first place. Ikaria comes to mind. Maybe even Grinva or Vodakhan, since you have Minotaur Tribal Synergy with Grinva, and the ability helps pull power out of your deck for Vodakhan. Whatever the case, I think this guy will only end up in very specific decks, since more quote-unquote good stuff type decks have other options at the 4 slot. The next card is Twinstrike Master, a 5-power 4/4 unit requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. Twinstrike Master has double damage and a mentor ability where you give the student double damage. I didn't really give this card much thought because the general consensus is that mentor is a very underpowered mechanic. But then I realized that Huru literally had no 5-drops with a mentor ability before this card was printed. A double damage on a 4 strength unit is pretty scary, especially if you can give that ability to another unit, like say Watcher of the Big Ones. You can flood the board pretty quick between these two, and you get essentially an 8/4, a 6/6, and a 5/5. That's pretty scary. Of course, you lose a ton of tempo doing so, but Watcher's job is to offset that tempo loss with the Carnosaur. Hopefully this gets tried out in some mentor brews. I think this is actually a pretty good card. The next card is Watchwing Conscript, a 6-power 5/3 unit requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. He has Revenge, and when he comes into play, if Watchwing Conscript has Destiny, you play a +2/+4 Valkyrie Wings with Flying and Aegis on him, and he is now a Valkyrie. I really want to believe this card is underrated because you essentially get a 7/7 flyer with Aegis once it comes back for Revenge. This guy's biggest problem is the underwhelming stat line you get for its initial cost of 6. A 5/3 with no evasion isn't that tough to deal with in the mid to late game where this would come down, and you really need to draw this back again to get true value out of it, which doesn't always happen. I really like this card, but I wouldn't disagree with anyone saying that it's a tough sell. The next card is Southwind Herald, a 3-power 3/2 unit requiring 2 Primal Influence to play. She has Flying. And at the end of your turn, if you have all 4 Wind Heralds, sacrifice them to play a 9/9 Avatar of Winds. We finally got an actual Exodia style card. I didn't expect Southwind Herald to have this type of effect, but it makes sense given that the South Herald was the only one not in the game yet. I'm just glad there's no more discrimination, personally. But all jokes aside, a few people have tried to brew with this, and unsurprisingly, it is very hard to pull off. All of the heralds are relatively frail, with Westwind Herald being the only one that's difficult to remove thanks to Aegis. Maybe there's a combo list out there that's viable that people haven't found yet, but if there isn't, I won't be surprised if this doesn't see serious play. The next card is Yeti Pult, a 4-power 4/1 unit requiring 3 primal influence to play. When this comes into play, you deal 1 damage to 3 enemies, and during your turn you can pay 7 and exhaust Yeti Pult to draw 3 cards, and you stun Yeti Pult. Personally, I think the summon effect is really good. Dealing with multiple X1 units definitely slows down certain aggro decks, but turn 4 is sometimes a little late to be dealing with early game aggro units from turn 1. The much bigger issue is this thing only having 1 health itself. It is very easy to remove this card, which is not what you want in a 4-drop. Of course, this also means that the other ability that draws you 3 cards is basically irrelevant. Yeti Pult stunning itself doesn't help either, meaning you can't even use the ability every turn. It helps mitigate flooding, but if your opponent can't kill a 4/1 unit by turn 7, that probably means you're either winning, or at the very least, you're not behind in any way. I doubt this sees serious play just because it's incredibly frail for a 4-drop. The next card is Huru Teachings, a 7-power spell requiring 2 primal influence to play. It has a mentor ability where for each of the student's battle skills, you play a 3/3 unseen disciple with that battle skill. Another underwhelming mentor card. The more I look at this card though, the more I think that Direwolf wants certain Huru decks to run Tranquil Scholar, because we got Master's Lesson and Omens of the Past, and now we have this. I still don't think either card is playable. For Huru Teachings in particular, it seems like you'd have to build up a unit to a point where they would have enough battle skills to where playing this is worth it, using Tranquil Scholar and other mentor units that grant abilities like Spirit Guide or the previously mentioned Twinstrike Master. But it's also pretty likely that unit gets removed before turn 7 unless you get Aegis off of Tranquil Scholar. It just doesn't seem worth it, but I could be wrong. The next card is Auric Interrogator, a 3-power 4/3 unit requiring 2 Shadow Influence to play. At the end of your turn, if Auric Interrogator has 5 strength or more, he deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. This is the first 5 strength matters card for Shadow, and it's a really solid one. Shadow as a single faction has been somewhat lacking when it comes to playable 3-drops. Similar to Fire, Cabal Countess is okay, but a bit slow to fully develop, and Shadowlands Guide is pretty narrow as far as what decks can actually play it. Of course, the challenge is getting this to 5 strength, but there are enough ways to do it. Stonescar has Bandit Queen, and to a lesser extent, weapons like the Thrive Falchion, and another weapon we'll be touching on in a bit. Argentport has access to the same weapons, but they also have access to Minotaur Oathkeeper and Paladin Oathbook, which I've personally been trying out, and it's been working pretty well so far. Xenon has access to stuff like Xenon Obelisk and Xenon Initiation as well. I expected the ability to be a way to keep aggro from running out of cards so quickly, and not so much an actual card draw engine, and that looks to be the case so far. A very strong 3-drop for Shadow. The next card is Sadistic Valkyrie, a 3-power 3/1 unit requiring 1 Shadow Influence to play. He has Flying and a Life Force ability where when you gain health, Sadistic Valkyrie gets Lifesteal. Not much to say on this one. It's a very disappointing 3/1 that costs 3. There's a reason you feel bad when you play Shadowlands Guide with no 1-drop to get back from your boy. The Flying and Lifesteal don't make up for the poor stats either. Skeeter is arguably as good as this card. The next card is Dueling Pistols, a 4-power weapon requiring 2 Shadow Influence to play. And the unit gains +2/+0 when it's equipped with these, and gains quick draw, and there's a summon ability where you give an enemy unit -2/-2. I'm surprised I haven't really seen anyone mess with this card, because when it initially got spoiled, the reactions were largely pretty positive. I've been testing this card, and I really like it so far, though that's mainly because I've actually started to move away from Bartholo in Argenport as a 3-drop. This isn't better than Lethrai Falchion, and by the way, if you're still running Bartholo, Lethrai Falchion is the better weapon to be playing, in my opinion. But if you're not running Bartholo in Argenport, you have less reason to run Falchion, making this an option to consider. The summon effect is very relevant, even if you can't kill anything with it, and that's because it also grants quick draw. Less stats on the opposing side of the table makes quick draw more effective overall. Auric Interrogators are happy to equip these in particular. Even Champion of Chaos would love having these if she's fully activated. Great card that's being underplayed, I feel. The next card is Waker of Ancients, a 2-power 1/2 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. While she's in play, your units with 5 strength or more have warp. I was less excited about this one when it first got spoiled. I'm still not excited for it. While it makes sense to have this in Praxis as a 2-drop, especially given that their early game units are arguably even weaker than Elysians, the reality is that a lot of their 5 strength cards already have warp on their own, those being Shatterglass Mage and Heart of the Vault. Now, this does give their single faction cards some extra value, like Sandstorm Titan and the recently added Crimson Firemaw. I just don't like 1/2 stat lines in this game because they're awful at fighting for the board. Nearly every popular 1-drop trades with them. Then again, Praxis midrange has always had early game units with weak stat lines, and it's still successful. So maybe they don't need this to have more stats. This is probably better than I'm willing to give it credit for. The next card is Vision of Austerity, a 2-power spell requiring 1 justice and 1 primal influence to play. You transform an enemy relic into an Omen of Austerity cursed relic. I think it's awesome that Relic Hate is being printed for other factions. Huru getting this is exciting for me. The effect from the Omen of Austerity fits Huru perfectly. This actually reminds me of effects I saw in other card games, particularly Magic the Gathering. I personally think this is better than Ruin and Decay, since they only take out the 1 copy of the relic already in play, whereas this also prevents any future copies of that relic from being played. But it's hard for me to say it's as good as Banish, which is more flexible. This isn't a card you want to ladder with though. This is definitely for tournaments that allow sideboarding, which all of them do currently. The next card is Tavrod Auric Broker, a 5-power 5/7 unit requiring 2 justice and 2 shadow influence to play. He has endurance, and when Tavrod attacks, draw a Minotaur and weapon from the top 5 cards of your deck. Give them +5 strength and discard the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, the metagame has gone into a bull market. I have a lot to say about this one. This guy is insane. People are screaming that this is OP and needs to be nerfed, and what was Direwolf thinking when they printed this guy? These are probably the same people that want Sandstorm Titan nerfed. Anyway, I think everyone needs to calm down. It's only been a week or so since this set released. We're not used to interacting with this card yet and haven't needed to until this point, so it's natural that we want to swing the banhammer at it. Speaking of which, yes, it is tough to interact with Tavrod. He's resistant to most removal due to him being a multi-faction unit. You can't stun him normally, and 7 health is a huge breakpoint since it takes him outside of nearly every burn spell in the game. Unless you want to count Polymorph, every hard removal spell in the game that does kill Tavrod is basically in the same factions that Tavrod is in. If you're not running Justice or Shadow, then you have to rely on stuff like deadly units or multiple damage sources to take Tavrod out. Like Auric Interrogator, Tavrod also keeps certain decks from truly entering top deck mode as long as he's attacking. All that being said though, despite him basically being the Sandstorm Titan of Argenport, Tavrod does cost 5, which is a lot higher than 4. An extra turn for aggro decks to get under decks running this guy is huge. Also, Tavrod still has to attack to get his full value, and even though the body will still be more than relevant, Tavrod players do care if their Tavrod gets silenced, if they're not ahead. I do think Tavrod is being overrated slightly, but he is an extremely good card, without question. The next card is Unexpected Results, a 4-power spell requiring 1 fire and 1 primal influence to play. You transform all copies of a spell of your choice from the enemy player's deck into firebombs. So this inevitably gets compared to Rain of Frogs, since it's the only other card with an effect like this one. It's weird because this is both better and worse than Rain of Frogs. It's better in the sense that instead of giving your opponent 1/1 frogs with Destiny, you're giving them firebombs that hurt them for 5 damage apiece instead. I'd rather be giving my opponent firebombs than frogs, because a 1/1 will still win the game if it sticks around long enough. But this card is worse because you can only target spells. Every deck runs spells, but there are very few decks that run a lot of spells. Both cards are mainly for sideboard use, especially Unexpected Results. But players will generally prefer Rain of Frogs since it's more flexible on the card choice. The next card is Cruciation, a 4-power spell requiring 2 time and 2 Shadow Influence to play. You kill a unit with a single faction and gain its health. I don't know why this doesn't just kill any unit, especially given the heavy influence requirement for a 4-cost card. The fact that this only kills single faction units really drops the viability of this card in Constructed. It's great if you hit a Sandstorm Titan with this, but that's what Annihilate's for, which is half the cost. I don't even think Life Force decks want this despite the health gain. I personally think this is one of the worst cards in the set. I'm pretty disappointed with this one. The next card is Triumphant Stranger, a 5-power 1/1 unit requiring 1 influence from every faction. This has +1/+1 for each stranger, and at the start of your turn, you create and play a random stranger. We've already started seeing players brewing with 5-faction stranger decks. I think it was only a matter of time before we got a stranger with this type of effect. The decks haven't gained traction yet, but it just feels like we keep getting a buildup of good stranger cards ever since Omen's released. I think the deck is close as far as viability, and it also scares me because when a stranger deck gets the proper draws, it can get very degenerate and requires a ton of counterplay just to neutralize them. This is a card to keep an eye on along with the last 2 cards. The next card is Stranger's Mark, a 0-power spell. When you play this, a unit of your choice is now a stranger. Interesting card. We're going into the realm of messing with the tribe of a unit. It's cool that the effect is permanent as well. I won't say much more since I personally haven't messed with the stranger archetype, but this could be a potential combo piece for a specific stranger deck. Even if it's not there right now, it might be possible in future expansions. At worst, this can give a unit certain abilities that have good synergy with ones they already have, such as a quick draw unit like Rakano Outlaw, gaining Deadly from Merciless Stranger, if you use this card. And the final card in the set is Horus Traver. He's a 1-power 1/1 unit, and when he comes into play, you gain an influence of your choice. A nice little 1-drop for strangers. The summon effect doesn't look that impactful, but getting any influence of your choice for something like 5-faction strangers is big. I could even see 3 or 4 Faction Stranger decks appreciating this card. Not much else to say on it, as a non-Stranger deck has little reason to run this card. And that's it for the card review. For those that stuck around to the end, thanks so much for listening to my thoughts on these. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If you did, feel free to like the video. If you want to check out more Eternal content, feel free to look around my channel. There's more content that I've got planned, so if you don't want to miss future videos, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Clicking the bell icon does guarantee that you won't miss a video from me if you don't mind notifications. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.